hope you all had a good lunch, because now we have some more very exciting talks, and it's my great pleasure actually to introduce to you Helga Nowotny, who in Europe is sometimes referred to as the Grand Lady of European Science. And when you read her curriculum, you will understand why. I met Helga about 7 years ago, 2006, in Vienna. And we discussed at that time Institute Paralimes, and I had coffee and Sachertorte. And I remember that because I don't like Sachertorte anymore. So. I had in fact come to Vienna to ask Helga whether she wanted to be a member of the science board of the Institute Paralimes. And that was the shortest part of the discussion, but her answer was yes, and then we could move to the next point. And the next point was the direction IPL should be taking, and that we spent a lot more time on. Now, the next time that I met Helga was at the first meeting of the science board that she attended, and that was in the fall of 2006. Helga made, as we asked from all the new members of the science board, a short presentation of her work. And the focal point of that work was the interaction between science and society. And I asked Helga if it was okay if I briefly summarized from the notes that I made on that. She agreed. So one of the points she made was that complexity is an obvious part of social studies. And it's, of course, very interesting to know. An interesting question is what social and physical systems have in common and what are their differences. And with relevance to the discussion this morning on coarse graining and bridging differences, she had 3 interesting points to make. She made 3 interesting points as to how you can explore complexity systems. One was through metaphors. Metaphors help to migrate concepts from ideas from one field to another, and they create a sense of openness. Another is through practitioners of complexity, people in finance, people in transportation, people in government, ecological and organizational systems. They are in the business of reducing complexity to a level that is manageable. And the third point she made was through a process-oriented way of thinking about social interaction, looking into issues like emergence, decision-making, and pattern development. You can see why we invited her today. And then she made a point about science in society, of which I will quote a few sentences. She said, the last decade, and we're talking 2006, so that was the first decade of this century. The last decade, there has been a change in attitude towards more openness. One reason is that there is less interest of young people in science, so science has to be more open to get young people interested. A crucial question is what possible contributions complexity science can make. It is wrong to assume that people want absolute certainty. People have a fine understanding about certainty. Now, not all these remarks were made sequentially, but they came out of this quote, this talk. And the science of complexity resonates with a deeper level of consciousness. So complexity science is in an excellent position to attract younger people, unquote. Helga didn't know it at that time, and neither did I, but in that presentation in Vienna, Helga gave the motivation for the complexity program at NTU, as well as the contact for very relevant research questions. It was therefore inevitable that I invited Helga to speak for this conference. And to my great delight, like in Vienna, she immediately said yes. So please welcome Helga Nowotny, the Grand Lady of European Science.
Thank you so much, Jan. It's always interesting if the past catches up with you, but I still want to find out your aversion to Sachertorte and who talked you into eating it. So it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to here. Yes, thank you very much. I would have noticed, but I have some slides here, so I'm not unprepared. My talk has 3 parts. At the first part, I take literally a look at society. I know there are various ways of looking. You can look at figures, you can look at graphs, you can look at the way how people think, you can look at patterns, but I decided to look at images. That's my first part. In my second part, I want to take us back into the notion of change in society, and here, no surprise, it's science, modern science and technology that have really changed the way how our societies work. And in the very last part, I want to come back to something that I think is there. It's there, but not very well explored, namely the temporal dimensions of complexity. So let me start with my literal first question: where is society? This is a society, a eusocial insect society, and as you know, there are many species of wasps, of bees, that differ in the way how they organize themselves, although there are certain characteristics they share. And of course, there are ants, another important eusocial species. And if you talk to researchers working on this, it is fascinating to discover not just the division of labor that we all know about non-producing workers and the queen, but actually they're interested because they found out the insects in this society, they know who the next queen will be. And this is a very interesting, fascinating question: how do they know? So it's an interesting topic, and it's a kind of society. This is perhaps somewhat closer to us. Groups of chimpanzees, and here we have already some affinities with the way how they group. Conflict is just as endemic in them as there is cooperation. And also, recent work has tended to emphasize a notion that has been taboo 20 years ago, namely that they also have something called culture. Now, this was a very controversial topic, but now more and more people agree there is a way of transmitting acquired knowledge to the young, to the next generation, which is one dimension of what culture is all about. And therefore, the question is, where is human society, and what do we understand by it? Balance of conflict and cooperation. Robert Axelrod's talk was very much about conflict, and we heard about cooperation in the very first talk. Altruism that goes beyond kin selection, which is one way how humanity has learned how to cooperate, going beyond kin genetically related individuals. And while we know what the unit of measurement is in biology and biological evolution, namely the reproductive success to have as many offspring as possible in your life, the unit of measurement in cultural evolution, in my view, is knowledge production and innovation. Now, what does human society look like? Are we talking about a good society, an old topic of philosophers, an ideal society, utopian society that was very much en vogue at the beginning, even before the Renaissance, people looking for ways how to change the society. They projected it into the future where utopia does not have a place as yet. But there are also failed societies and sustainable societies. This is an ideal society, Plato's Academy. And as you remember, he proposed that the philosopher should be the ruler, something that in real life has not worked out very well. There are societies that have gone bad, and this is a vision by Hieronymus Bosch of the Last Judgment, Hell. There are failed societies. This is the very well-known book by Acemoglu and Robinson on the importance of institutions in why certain societies succeed and others do not. And Jared Diamond and many others looking at unsustainable societies that have disappeared from the earth, literally. One thing that human societies certainly have is the notion of underlying power. I'm not going to give you a lecture what political scientists say about power and how it differs from authority and how it differs from status, but power is a notion and power can be institutionalized either through coercion or through persuasion, and you have everything in between. But something that is very important to say about power is that it needs to be legitimized. In other words, the people who are governed, the people who are ruled, have to have some way of accepting that power is there. And once this is accepted, and the Leviathan was one way in which Thomas Hobbes tried to explain why people accept absolute government by the absolute monarchs of the day as embodying, literally, the Leviathan embodies the will of the people. You have other imageries here sailing together, again, in an uncontested way. But what followed in history was the contestation of power by various means, the fall of the Bastille, and we see here workers striking, we see other angry people speaking up against the power that ruled them. Now, there are, of course, the component parts, what makes up society. And here we see a collection of individuals representing visually component parts of various societies. You see Augustus on the left representing the power of his day, the Roman Empire. You see St. Aquinas for the Middle Ages. You see Lao Tse. You see individuals here in East Asia, and you see on the very right side, you see the utopian image of the genetic individual of the future. This is the way how the life scientists look at individuals as component parts, and the way how we are all unique but nevertheless related to each other. There is yet another way of looking for representations of component parts. These are groups, social groups. And what is interesting here is that none of you have any difficulty in contextualizing what you see. By looking at this group on the left side, you see that this is a well-off noble family somewhere in Europe. You see that it's a related group at ease. And on the right side, you see a politician addressing the people to rally behind her. So we have no difficulty in making inferences from such group pictures, and you could go on, show different kinds of pictures. We have no difficulties in interpreting it in a wider context. And today's societies are a composition of consumers. This has become a very important, although not the most important feature of the way how we interpret and see societies today. Voters, certainly, producers. And the question is, are these producers more than just producing material goods? Are they also producers of knowledge? Is there something that can enable them to make them innovators? Is there something out there that can make them participants in what is these days called citizen science? Now, these, like everyone else, of course, realizes it has become a truism that it's not the individual components, it's the relationship between being individuals, be it groups, in whatever arrangement, social arrangement, political, economic arrangement, knowledge arrangements, we find them. But we also see that there are shifts going on in this globalized world. And the sense of the whole is also changing. Now, To summarize briefly, this first part of trying to find how do we represent, how do we actually look at, and what does society look at in terms of visual imagery, we end up, or I end up by saying there is a sense of un-wholeness. It's very difficult to imagine society as a whole. We imagine parts, we can imagine certain kinds of relationships, but it's very, very difficult to imagine society as a whole. And what we imagine, if you want to close your eyes and think of, what comes to your mind now in terms of society, you will get some conscious and some very unconscious images cropping up in your mind. And asking this question, of course, is highly context dependent. It depends on the time. We have seen different historical episodes. It depends on the place where we are and who selects what for which purpose. And this also means that the media of representations differ, whether we look at a statue of ancient Roman times or whether we look at a photograph of today. It makes a difference also in terms of the imagery that it evokes in our minds. And there are various media here that we have used. And of course, advertisement has become one of the most interesting, not just predominant, but most interesting ways of influencing us today in terms of representing this unwholeness. The unwhole representation can also take on a life of its own. You see on the left, a flag is being burned. Now you can say, why do people get so enraged if their flag is being burned? Precisely because it is a symbol. It stands for something else, and this is why people can get tremendously enraged and angry if their flag is being burned, while the others, of course, in an aggressive way, choose this way of proceeding. And so this unwholeness, and especially if we look at particular parts of it, we see hierarchies, we see segmentation, we see fragmentation. So there is, between these various parts, there is void, or maybe I should say in-betweenness. In-betweenness, the layers, the groups, the individual components, and this in-betweenness is filled out because the human mind abhors a vacuum. We fill it out with what Yaron Etzrachi and others call collective imaginaries. Collective imaginaries are images that people have in their mind in terms of what they think exists, should exist. It's a very vague and fluid notion, and yet it is very, very important to perform these imageries and in order to have these voids functioning in terms of connecting the various parts. Let me now turn to the second part of my presentation. And here I wanted to take, again, a crude look, a crude and very simplified look, using images, again, across time and space. For time reasons, I had to eliminate space. I apologize, but let me just say, if you delve into the history of maps, it's a fascinating topic because it shows you all the early images have always the collective we at the center. So people were looking at the world from their we-centered perspective. And although now, since Mercator, we have sort of a standardized version of what the world looked like, there are some interesting attempts to change the way how maps are being made and represented, namely in terms of inequalities that exist on this earth. So it's a fascinating topic, but as I said, I don't have the time to go into it. So I want to concentrate here at a crude look across time. And what is interesting here is we know change goes on continuously. It goes on sometimes with ruptures. We have also our own way of describing what are epochs, what are important events. If you go to Europe and you ask people what is the significance of 1969, you get a certain set of answers, which we share with the US. If you go and ask what is the importance of 89, you get already some different answers, because 89, the fall of communism, meant the liberation of one part of Europe that made it possible to have the European Union in the way how it exists now, while in this part of the world, 89, yes, on a cognitive, intellectual level, of course, you know it happened, but it does not have this very deep meaning in terms of changing a biography, changing the fate even and of a country or of a continent. So how do we represent these social dynamics across time? One of the oldest, again, is coming, and it's an organic metaphor, because you mentioned metaphors. So it's a tree. And the tree of life plays an important role in evolutionary biology, but it also plays an important role in genealogy, the way how people have mapped, have visualized changes in terms of their family history. Where do I come from? With whom am I related? And it contributes to give you a sense of where you have come from, where you are now, your sense of identity. But of course, we have also, in terms of modern economic volatility, especially in the last years, we have become accustomed to these kind of representations of change in the stock market and related phenomena. But let me go back to what I think has been one of the most important events in the history of humanity that happened to take place in Europe, the institutionalization of modern science. Historians have asked the question, why did it happen in Europe? It's typically a question that is hypothetical, because it happened in Europe and not anywhere else. But we know that institutions did play an important role, but we also know that individuals played an important role. And this is, in the beginnings of modern science, there were two very important premises on which it was based. One was to claim, and this was a claim in the beginning, that the laws, and of course law is a metaphor taken from the social world, the world of politics, that nature's law are above the will of the rulers of the day. They are above whatever the political authority, the monarch typically says, or what the religious authorities, the church in those days, says. The laws of nature are not subject to human arbitrariness. This was an important premise going on to explore the laws of nature. And sometimes I think that this very easy division that science is about facts and society is about values overlooks one very important fact, namely that the free inquiry of science is based on a value, namely free inquiry. So you have there already a mixture. And the second important premise is linked to the Baconian program. I single it out not because it was better than others, but because Bacon articulated his vision in a very coherent way. There were many other individuals throughout Europe that formed part of what we would now call a social movement. And historians speak about the scientific revolution, but it was really a social movement going on across quite a length of time, involving small groups, and social movements always start with a small group of people who see a common purpose. And the common purpose of the Baconian program and its equivalents in other parts were that through the systematic inquiry into the way how nature works, you can change the human condition to its betterment. So this was a very, very strong belief. It was tied to very pragmatic and pragmatic goals, namely how to improve the human condition to make life better for everyone, and at the same time the systematic inquiry by means that would yield answers. Bacon spoke about imitating nature, and in one of his utopian pieces called The House of Solomon, he was sending out, this was a secret society devoted to the betterment of humanity, and he was sending out the members of the society everywhere in the world to pick up the knowledge and skills wherever they could find it, bring it back, and if you read it today, you know, you are just struck by the visionary words that he had. Many of the technological applications that we take for granted today, they were already in Bacon's dream, if you want to call it like this. And this systematic inquiry of nature needs to use certain methods, in particular the experimental method, that would tell you, and that was the image behind it, whether you can ask nature the right kind of questions, and if you ask her the right questions, you get some answers, never all the answers you are looking for. You have to ask again, and this is the continuous process that we call research, asking good questions of nature, getting some answers, improving on that, and moving on. So the image that you see here, again, is a telling one. It shows this sense of openness, exploring, and the two pillars have a specific meanings. They were the pillars of Hercules, that were the limits in the ancient world beyond which humans could not trespass. And here you have the ships moving in and out the harbor, bringing in this opening of the world. Later on, the technology, of course, played an important role. Even if the emphasis was on the systematic inquiry of nature, technology in the beginning was trial and error, but later on it became a science-based technology, and this is something that we have now taken for granted, that science and technology mutually influence each other, work with each other. And it led to something that Joan Mokyr, the economic historian, calls the Industrial Enlightenment. Now, curiosity played an important role in all this. Curiosity was under the way how the Catholic Church looked at it, it was something that was frowned upon. It was something to be constrained, because you would never know where it takes you. And this is precisely one of the dimensions of curiosity. If you follow your curiosity, you do not know where you will end up. You do not know where it will lead you. And this is also one of the reasons why all societies at any time do something to tame this curiosity. And curiosity comes in two variants. One is artistic curiosity and one is scientific curiosity. And every society, when I say tame, means either directed in certain directions, like, you know, we want impact, we want economic growth, etc., or forbidding certain activities in saying they are too risky, etc. But curiosity is an important driving force, but it cannot go completely unrestrained. So this then brings me to the role that is played by also in innovation and what research, science, innovation do. I will come back to prediction. Woody Allen famously said it's difficult to predict, especially the future. And the enormous way how research has changed our lives means that we are actually at the very beginning of further changes. It's a fat-tailed probability that research will yield much, much more, that will continue to transform our society. And I think that in many ways, this imagination and imaginary, the collective imaginaries, as we see them in art, in film, in the visual arts, and so on, are part of the cultivating seeding ground in which other innovation takes root. Now, I have a famous countryman by the names of Josef Schumpeter, who wrote a book in 1911, so it's more than 100 years now, which was frowned upon by the economists of his day, although then he went on to become a famous and later infamous finance minister and so on. But Schumpeter was one of the first economists really to look at what happens in innovation. And he made it clear that innovation creates economic expansion. It does not follow on it. He made it clear that it's the individual entrepreneur, which for him, this was an individual that never only followed the profit move. There was something extra, something that, that the entrepreneur wanted to change. And the difficulties in innovation was there for this heroic entrepreneur to overcome it. And again, he looked very closely at the necessary finance capital that was needed for innovation of his days, etc. But again, he gave a lot of emphasis to the individual acts of the entrepreneur. And he realized very early on that innovation is a double-bladed sword in the sense of creative destruction. It opens new avenues, new jobs, new professions, new ways of doing things, but this also means that others are disappearing. Innovation is also inherently uncertain, just as research, not development, but research is a process with uncertain outcomes. You do not know as yet what you will find. And therefore, it all means that you have to explore and exploit the opportunities. You have to, for new or improved products, and innovation is a matching process of the opportunities that are there and what you can offer. It's also very difficult to predict accurately, as Brian Arthur and others know very well. Even if you know the beginnings of it, there are lock-in situations and so on, so to make it. But what is most difficult, and this is one of the reasons why so many technological predictions fail, not because they cannot see, they know precisely where we are and what the future technological improvements can be, but what they cannot predict because it's so difficult is the uses to which innovation will be put. And therefore, and I'm just here bringing to your attention that normally we speak about two different kinds of innovation, the incremental innovation that goes on all the time. Firms, organizations have to continue to innovate, and they do so in order to reproduce success. James March, the organizational sociologist, has looked into the question, why do successful firms innovate at all? They have it all. They want to reproduce success. So for them it is counterproductive to try to innovate. And his answer is, first of all, there's the over self-confidence of the leaders of the firms. So they think they know it all. And the others is that in replicating success, like in replicating DNA, errors creep in. So you have something similar to mutations, and this is how the new gets even into the most successful firms. And then, of course, we know that the innovation process is very varies greatly depending on the sector. If you speak about the pharmaceutical sector, it's a different way of innovating compared to the IT sector due to regulation, etc., etc. But then there are radical innovations. And all radical innovations are science-based. This is one of the reasons why societies have to continue, that want to make a difference, have to continue to invest in what Abraham Flexner famously called the uselessness, the usefulness of useless knowledge, of what is seemingly useless knowledge, because you do not see the uses as yet to which it will be put. Nevertheless, it will turn out to be useful, but it is impossible to predict whether this happens in 5 years or in 30 years. And there are many examples, GPS and other devices that we use. Without Einstein and like-minded people who preceded him, we would not have these kind of radical innovations. And radical innovations also come together to induce these kind of radical transformations that we see. Now, I would therefore conclude this part on innovation by saying it's an emergent property of interactivity in a time-compressed present. And these, what I call elaborative practices of innovators, they have to take form, they must become visible, they have to find an organizational space into which they fit. We know about the inertia of large systems. You can have a bright idea, you can even have a bright technical artifact. Yet if the system is not ready for it because you have to change too much in it, it will take a longer time until you can transform the entire system. So there are these inertia and other ways that hinder that, and this is part of the double-edged sword, of course, of innovation of which Schumpeter spoke. Now, let me turn to the third part of my presentation, namely the temporal dimension of complexity. I have now taken you, in the previous section, I tried to take you through change in society, the way how we imagine it, the way how we visualize it, but also what has made the difference, namely scientific curiosity, systematic inquiry into nature, aided by technology, innovation. And now we come to the way, and this is something that I have been interested in for a long time, namely how do we construct time? Social time is a construct because it's based on us being biological beings. So we have an inbuilt error of time in our life that goes from birth to death. This again is based on a physical concept of time. So if you want, there's a hierarchy of time. But we have some leeway in the way how we perceive time, how we construct time, how we interact with and through time. Now, the most familiar, of course, is the concept of linear time, past, present, and future. And, and this image that you see here, sorry. is how a successful gambler looks at the world. Successful gamblers who are willing to take risks, and they succeed for the most part, not always, but for the most part, in taking the risks. So it's an interesting question, how important is their past to them, the experience, of course, which also gamblers depend, to what extent they are Bayesians or how they use the Bayesian concepts. But perhaps more interesting is how does a gambler look at the future? And here you see that they give the greatest attention to the present, The past is there, but it's a more blurred vision. The future is less blurred, but it's the present that that matters to them. Cyclical time is a concept that many societies have been familiar with. L'éternel retour, the eternal going back to the origin, or you have in some civilizations the idea of time as coming from a golden age where everything was wonderful, and now we are on a sort of entropic path of degradation. And then the world starts anew from hopefully a golden age again. So there are all these notions of cyclical time. Of course, we are also familiar with cyclical time because we speak of business cycles, we speak of life cycles, we speak of the life cycle of products. So it's built into our sense of time as well. And this here I found quite interesting, because it shows that our perception of what we can predict is also depending on the historical context. If you start from a 50% evenness, what is predictable, what is unpredictable, you see a drop in predictability in the 30s, which was, of course, the economic depression, the war years, where indeed life had become, in general, much more unpredictable, the outlook on the future, very, very blurred. Then you see a rise again in the 70s, and now we are slowly declining again in our perception, or you can also say in our confidence in being able to predict. These are other forms of representing business cycles in particular. And again, it's interesting on the left side, the spiral, an old geometric form that allows for a different sense going up or going down, depending on how you look at it, versus a linear form of prediction. And so, and this is my question, whether with science and technology and curiosity and innovation, having really opened up the present era of enormous potential, and if you look into the things that life scientists speak about in particular, it's an enormous range of potential that is being opened up to us. Whether we are not also entering a new time regime, that's the question I have. A new time regime, which perhaps one can call nonlinear time dynamics. And this, of course, has been, again, prefigured with trials, experiments of an artistic kind. Film, visual arts, going back in time, showing things at the same time, or taking you in the emotional responses that films can generate, taking you through various time regimes, theater, music, of course, that embodies time somehow. So all this gives you, again, one of these cultivating grounds out of which perhaps a new time regime is about to emerge. And if indeed there is such a nonlinear time dynamics in the making, it means, of course, not that it's replacing linear time. As I said, as biological beings, we have the arrow of time in our genes, we have it in our body, we know it, we feel it, we live it. Likewise, the physical world, we know cyclical time, we recognize the cycles that are built into this linear time concept, but non-linear time may add another dimension as yet. And by this non-linear time dynamics, I mean the time sense that is generated by the creative processes that involve individuals and collectivities, knowledge and technology in novel ways in the way how they interact. Very often people say, well, everything is going so fast now. they draw attention to the speed, the acceleration. You know, look at where we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, where we are now. And I tend to think there may be something to acceleration, but it is more a question of approximating things happening at the same time, and our ways of trying to cope with things happening almost at the same time. Now, certainly things happen at the same time. This is a representation of what happens on the internet every 60 seconds. Now, 60 seconds are almost over while I speak. And look at, the numbers here. 168 emails have been sent while I began this sentence, and so on and so on. And of course, by the interaction that is generated in this virtual and non-virtual space here, you can imagine data generating more data, big data generating more big data, and it is this what I mean by this non-linear time dynamics. Now, there is one thing to be said about the creative process, because underlying curiosity, innovation, there is human creativity. And the creative process, connecting what was not connected before, finding new forms, new contents, new interactions, all this is always inherently uncertain. You do not know success. And by success, I don't mean, a big notion of success. I see success as being one of two things. Either you have a predefined goal that you want to reach, then you have successfully reached this goal, you can move on to your next goal. Or you simply have the sense of having achieved something. It works. That's my second definition of success. It works. It can be a small thing, it can be a medium-sized or a big thing. It works. And the way how social systems that are high-performance selection systems, like science, seeing all the young people here in the audience, you are used to going through exams, you are used through competitive events all the time. You apply for a grant, you apply for this, for that. You are part of high performance selection systems. And the systems do this to you because they want to reduce uncertainty by doing that. And of course, you are part of the system. We see it also in sports and so on, in order to cope and to reduce the uncertainty of success. Now, returning to this nonlinear time dynamics, as I said, the approximation of timelessness, I think, is more important than just the sense of speeding up. There are co-temporalities, meaning there are different time regimes coexisting next to each other. And creativity and innovation are an important emergent property of this interactivity in what I call a time-compressed present. It's not so much about the future, it's about the time-compressed present. Now, creativity and work has something to do with each other. When I said one definition of success for me is it works, I want to draw your attention to what work can also mean. It works when you go back in human history. The first tools that were found outside of caves where our ancestors lived and the like, the first tools according to the paleontologists studying this, they can reconstruct that it was an extension of the human hand. So technology as the extension of the human hand. We have long since moved to technology as the extension of the human mind, and we have found new interfaces between technology as an extension of the human hand, the human mind, and of course the technological artifact. I don't know how many of you have read an article that made it to the front page of the Financial Times on Friday. And this was Science News on page 1 of the Financial Times. This was about an experiment conducted with rats in the US and rats in Brazil. Now, this was a Brazilian who was working in the US, and he had set up with his former lab an experiment with implanted electrodes in the minds of rats. And the rats were rewarded for doing certain tasks responding to visual signs. But only one part of the rats had the visual signs. The others did not have the visual cues, but they were connected through electrons with the mice that could do it. And in 70% of the cases, the mice that had no visual cues were able to mimic the results that were obtained with the other ones. Now, mice are rewarded with food. It's very simple, but humans want food and something else. Humans want also recognition. And this is therefore very important to start to rethink work and what this kind of technology that connects hands, minds, technological artifacts, what this does to the way how we attribute credit and how we attribute reward. And it's becoming much more difficult to say this is the individual contribution, because unless the beehive, it's not just workers and the queen, but we are much more egalitarian in terms of our contributions. Nevertheless, we have to find ways of rewarding, which means also motivating individuals and collectivities in order to interact and to be creative. And the more we put the emphasis on technological innovation, I think the more we have to start thinking seriously also about social innovation. Sometimes I call it the dark energy of society, you know. Physicists, the astronomers tell us, you know, there is this huge percentage of dark energy. Nobody knows what it is in the universe. And sometimes I feel social innovation is the dark energy of society. We don't quite know what it is, but we know it is very, very important. Embedding technological innovation needs a social organization. It needs social arrangements that also have to be innovative in order to be able to appropriate and to make use of it. So I come to the end of my presentation, 3 concluding looks at the societal whole or unwhole, depending on how you look at it. The importance of connections from parts of or for the whole to this very complex multi-agency interaction between parts, and whatever interacts, it's not only mediated through technology, it's also engendered through technology. Technology becomes part of the creative process itself. And instead of a causal error and linear time concept, going from past to the present to the future, we see the many feedback loops, we see the interaction in this extended time compressed present. Second conclusion, we know this is not evenly distributed. There are some places, and Nanyang has become one of these places, where a creative environment has been created. And creating a creative environment implies that you cannot foresee everything. You must leave room for things to emerge. We know how important in any research process, and part of my present function as president of the European Research Council, I speak to a lot of researchers. And part of it is that they tell you how important serendipity is. Serendipity in the research process simply means you find something that you have not been looking for, but you recognize its importance. And so you have to be prepared, and yet if you're over-prepared, the chances are big that you will miss it, but you have to be able to see it. And serendipity plays an enormous role, and the more we open up towards technology being part of the way how we interact, the more we have to think how can we also optimize serendipity to occur. And then, of course, the diversity of encounters, all this is part of what makes a creative environment creative. And my last third look is at the relationship between evolution and complexity. In biological terms, we know that there have been major transitions, but there is nothing in biology that tells us or that follows that evolution should move in the direction, because evolution is non-directed. It's non-teleological. So there's nothing in evolution that tells us that there should be increased complexity. Nevertheless, it happens. And I think that cultural evolution, which is what I've been speaking about, science, research, technology, innovation, here we see an increase of complexity, which is manifest in, among other things, in this nonlinear time dynamics. So, can curiosity, creativity, and innovation hold the societal whole together? And there are three related questions with which I will leave you. What kind of society do we want to live in? How to organize this kind of society in which we want to live effectively? And how can we keep this kind of society open for further evolution and the future? Thank you very much.
Well, does it work? Yeah, you can use this. Okay. It seems to me that the last three questions are precisely the questions that occupy Singapore at the moment. But I'm quite sure that there's a lot of ideas in the audience, and questions in the audience after having heard this very fascinating talk by Helga. Who can I give the word?
Yes. Is it working? Okay. My name is Zulfikar Amir from Sociology NTU. I truly enjoy your talk. It's really inspiring. But I have one question related to the notions of the notion of the wholeness that we've been talking about in this conference. As we understand that social science researchers, particularly sociologists and economists, are divided into two big groups in the way they see society. The first group look at the micro level, the interaction between individuals. And the other groups look at the macro level, try to understand the behavior of society from the macro system. And we learned that for the past decades, there's been a perspective or concept that are offered by thinkers like Giddens' structuration or Bourdieu habitus in trying to connect these two levels, micro and macro. And I think social scientists are also having a good opportunity when they start using what natural scientists have provided, like a network a science. So network analysis has emerged as something that can connect these two levels in order to understand or to capture a clear picture of how society works. And it becomes more practical these days as we know that a lot of institutions, individuals, groups are interconnected through network, and this become the main characteristic of globalized society. But I think there's something that makes me, puzzled about the emergence of networks everywhere, which is constitute my question to you. To what extent, in your view, do structures remain relevant in our society? I mean, if structures are still relevant, what are the epistemological and socio-political implications that we should take into account in understanding the complexity of society?
Okay, this was a long question, but I will have to give you a shorter answer. I think one of the reasons why social networks have become also very attractive for sociologists, for instance, is because they offer new kinds of data that did not exist before. The methods open to social scientists, sociologists in particular, where the traditional one, you could either do micro-level observation, you could do survey analysis, you could do all kinds of things in between the micro level, the mid-range level, the macro level. And of course, you always had people who were modeling in the sense how Bob showed us this morning. But with the data now becoming available, who contacts whom, be it Facebook, be it telephone calls, etc., there's a new way to look at networks as structures. Now, structures are not the same as what you refer to as structuration. And I think the next challenge is indeed to look beyond it, because we will see what methods in the social sciences have always been telling you. You need to have the right kind of method for the kind of questions you ask. There is no universal method in the social sciences. You have to be very carefully in choosing the method that fits your question. And depending on your research question, you can use network data. And for others, if you ask, for instance, after we have been celebrating, Facebook on the Tahrir Square and have seen this as the way how the future will work, but the future did not work this way. And therefore, you have to go back and to say, well, it's a great mobilizing way of bringing people to the Tahrir Square, but this does not solve the problems that the people in the Tahrir Square wanted to address.
Other questions? That is hard to believe, actually. Sheila.
Sheila Ranis from Walsh College. I think it's interesting that your view of creativity assumes a lot of freedom. And one of the problems that, at least in the United States, we face, and I think many other nations face it as well, is that the way we have structured our doctoral education is very unidimensional, so that you learn more and more about less and less. And it has not been helpful, frankly, in helping societies solve the large, complex problems that require this interdisciplinary approach. In the United States, one of the lines of research that we've been looking at has led us to look at the methods which faculty members get promotion and tenure, for example, and the narrowness of the journals that they can publish in. And one of the things I'd like to ask is, have the Europeans found some solutions to looking at it, since I think European scientists are a little more open to systems approaches and interdisciplinary approaches, but I know it is a struggle everywhere. And we've traced it to some of our higher education accreditation bodies and the way in which they accredit institutions. But the political realities of changing that are huge. but I think it would go a long way toward changing the creativity and innovation of all of society if you could free up at least the way we educate people. Comments?
Yes, I think you're right of having spotted an underlying sense that indeed creativity needs freedom, it needs autonomy, and it needs people who can use this freedom. Now, academia, and we have many, horror stories to tell of the narrow-mindedness, etc. But I think unless academia wakes up to it, academia is doomed. And I was recently speaking to someone working in cybersecurity. And he told me that the US Pentagon is now looking to fill, I don't know how many positions, you know this much better. And, I asked him, where will these people come from? And he said, well, we are going to recruit hackers from the hacking community. So we are bypassing the academic community. We won't find these people that we are looking for there. We are going to the hacking community. And with the other big, wave of change that I see coming with online courses, opening up new spaces, and so on, you will have an enormous pressure on academia either to change or, creative destruction go down in history as an interesting episode of the way how we educate our people.
Thank you. Enjoyed the lecture very much. The comment you made toward the end about the need for recognition of creative workers. We actually, I work in a large software company. We have about 4,000 creative software engineers working in teams solving complex software problems creatively. And what we found, we've actually studied and researched their motivations and behavior, and we find that recognition matters even more than money. You have to pay them well. It's a kind of a minimum. There's no doubt about it. But the truth of the matter is that the recognition from their peers and from above is actually one of the most important rewards from their point of view. And a failure to give that is highly demotivating.
Yes, thank you for the confirmation.
Over there. In the middle of the fifth row.
Hello. I actually have a question about when you talked about the different views of time. You had linear time, you had cyclical time, and you had non-linear time dynamics, right?
Yes.
So my question is that with non-linear time dynamics, it's a new conceptual way to view time, right? Are there any applications of this conception of time to so-called like optimize society, or with a particular example, innovation, in order to bring about and optimize more innovation in society using such a conception of time?
This is difficult to answer because one would have to look at very specific cases. If you say optimizing, incentives work, but incentives very often, once you have a predefined goal or a target that you're reaching, you give freedom of how to reach it, but the target is there. Now, you can, of course, compress the time, but if you compress it too much, you will not get the results. So you have to find a balance of slack time, and creative time cannot be planned. At the same time, if you give only creative time and no time restraints whatsoever, you will not get there either. So this is it's a delicate balance that you have to set up in order to reach this goal.
Two questions. First, the gentleman over there.
The comment on the reward system as regards a large software company in which recognition from peers turn out to be even more important than financial rewards. I was just wondering if this can be transplanted to the financial community as well. maybe you will help us to tackle the issue of bonuses.
Well, you know, wearing my other hat is I'm actually the president of the the most important European funding agency for basic research, fundamental research. We call it frontier research. And we spend every year, and this year we spent in euros, I don't know in Singaporean dollars, but we spent 1.7 billion euros for fundamental research without any predefined theme. This is very important. It's a true bottom-up project. And it's individual researchers. It's not groups. They have a team, but we look only at the individuals. Now, in order to evaluate, and this really covers all areas of science and scholarship, the humanities are also included. So what we find is that the only group, sometimes I'm asked, well, you know, is it not difficult for the humanists? Do they need other criteria for evaluation? I see every community has slightly different criteria, and the panelists know how to deal with it. The only panel that consistently does things differently are the economists. And, you know, I don't know why, but for instance, other panels in evaluation, you have the reports, you discuss, you want to reach some kind of consensus. And they do everything to reach this consensus with good arguments. And they vote only if you really have a deadlock, and then the chair says, well, if we want ever to get out of this place now, I had take a vote. But it's the last resort. The economists love to vote. And, you know, and they play games, clever games, thinking they can anticipate how the colleagues react. So they enjoy themselves, but they are different from the rest.
John Richardson, yes.
Yeah, John Richardson from the Lee Kuan Yew School. You haven't said much about failure. And as a funder and a leader of research, and I know I have students who are doing research on entrepreneurship, we know that failure is one of the most important ingredients of creativity, because if you don't, if you aren't prepared to fail, you can't be creative. But institutionalizing failure as a funder or as a university president or as a corporate leader or as a government leader is quite difficult. So talk a little bit how personally, as a research leader, you create the opportunity for failure, and how you counsel others to do that.
Well, as a research funder, the European Research Council encourages applicants who have reached a certain threshold to look carefully at the comments by the panel members, which the panel writes, and to resubmit. And we have, over the years, we are now 6 years young. Over the years, we see a more or less constant rate of 40% successful reapplications. So it's an interesting empirical figure per se, because there was nothing to compare it with before we came into existence. So if you encourage those who almost made it, but the resources are not there and they were not in a very competitive system, we have a success rate of 12% only. So this stratum is encouraged to submit again, and so it's one comment. In terms of innovation, permit me also to say something about the difference between the US and Europe. I don't know about this part of the world, but in Europe we are usually told, you know, look at the Americans, failure just means get up and go again, and Europeans give up. Now, the fact is that in the US you have much more venture capital than in Europe. So if you fail, it is much easier in the US, you know, to come back again. And in Europe, very often it means, indeed, it's the end. You tried, you failed, that's it, do something else. In terms of research careers, again, I think part of the European system, not in the UK, but in continental Europe, we have a way of selecting far too late the people who will stay in academia as full professors. And then they are very often too old to find adequate positions elsewhere. And this is why I think, compared to the tenure track system in the US, and also a system that allows you, if you don't succeed in Harvard, you go to, there are many other places besides Harvard. And in Europe, due to having more national systems still dominant, and having these, you nurture people with the hope, and then you select far too late because there are not enough positions. So that's another slice of your question. In terms of a research leader with a research group, this is the most difficult, because you have to say, you have to rely on your own judgment, personal judgment. Can the person make it? And there the importance is really, does the person have the perseverance and the inner fire? Is the curiosity drive strong enough, and is the persistence in the likelihood of failure strong enough to go on? And if not, it's better to say, it's better you leave science.
The lady over there.
Caroline Fiss from sociology. It ties in very nicely what you said, because I'm far from convinced that creativity comes out of having space. I think a lot of people are creative because they're under a lot of constraint. So they're creative out of necessity. Just thinking about immigrant entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. There are a disproportionate number of successful entrepreneurs. And they're successful, they are creative because, first of all, they're forced into a new environment. They have a lot of contradictions they have to deal with. And for me, somehow creativity is putting two things together. If you are too comfortable, you could be too lazy to do that. So, in a way, creativity cannot be taught. And if it comes out of necessity, I think a lot of people, painters, whoever, they were maybe a bit crazy or whatever, a lot of creativity comes out of, it does not come out of tranquility. And I didn't quite understand what you meant by time compressed. Present, you mean the time-space compression? Or what is time compressed? Present?
Okay, so time compressed present means we are putting many, many things together in the same unit of time. This is a way of speaking, of course, compressing time by multitasking, essentially. And since we have many more options available, we want to do many more things. This in comparison to a generation or two generations before that had far fewer things. So this is your first answer. The answer to your last point. On the first point, constraints and creativity. My favorite researcher, my ideal researcher, is what I would call a competent rebel. Competence must be there, but at the same time, you need a rebellious spirit in the sense of not accepting what the older generation tells you. But you have to be competent enough to ask the right kind of questions to challenge the authority that is there. So it's both the spirit of rebellion, but you need the competence to do it. And this is yet another form of creativity that has many, many different incarnations.
Yes.
Yes, it's just a clarification. I think you made two statements. That one was that there's no linear translation, I think, or linear model. Right? But
in,
later,
in innovation.
in innovation, right. And
yeah.
then you later said that all radical innovations are science-based. That sounds like a linear model statement a little bit, so
Yeah,
hack it or
it's not meant. The linear model of innovation is something that is known in the literature of people who work on innovation. And it goes back to the time after the Second World War when indeed something like this existed. You were going from basic research to application to market. And this is what Vannevar Bush in his Manifesto Science, the Endless Frontier, put into his manifesto. Now, since then, things have changed a lot, and we know from empirical studies, we know also from theoretical ideas looking at the way how innovation actually occurs, many case studies putting things together. This linear model makes no sense. And you also have many areas where you cannot draw a distinction anymore between fundamental research and applied research. It makes no sense at all. This is particularly the case in the life sciences, but not only. In the life sciences, you know, 1 hour you do something fundamental, and next hour you do something which is applied. And this has to do with the fact the cell has become a laboratory. So you need, and in many labs today, you need research technologies which help you to ask your next question, but you also need them to answer your question. So the linear model of innovation in the technical sense, I think, is obsolete. Now, radical innovation just means you have to have, you can trace back the innovations that really transformed whole sectors, the whole society. If you look at, you know, the way how we use computers today, first of all, it's an ongoing long process. You cannot say, you know, this happened on day X and then everything was changed. These sort of ruptures do not occur. And if you, for instance, George Dyson wrote this wonderful book, Turing's Cathedral, that came out last year, I think, on, well, it's about the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And he shows Turing's idea were crucial. At the same time, without von Neumann, without the war effort, you know, we would not be where we were today. And this is what I mean with science-based. And then we have these radical transformations and radical innovations.
We have time for a few more questions.
Back to the radical innovation, the missing link, point of curiosity. Well, when you mention incremental and then subsequently radical, well, any real innovation is radical by nature. A quantum innovation, you don't talk about something which is incremental to become something radical. Now, the question is that also the missing link here is about replicative innovation. Too often we find too many replicative innovation, which is not quantum innovation. So my point here, wanting to ask you, is that the difference between disruptive innovation and then the distinction with your radical innovation, how do you define within disruptive as what Christensen would like to define and yours? So the question is, he doesn't use radical because radical in any innovation is radical. Thanks.
Well, as with any distinctions, you can use it analytically and you can use it because you want to have a certain question that you address. The distinction between incremental, if you want to call it replicative, it is replication, but it's replication with a mutation. Or, you know, there's, you don't, when I spoke before about replicating success, it means by and large, you replicate, but nevertheless, you never replicate completely, be it only because your environment has changed. And innovation takes place in an environment that continuously changes and to which you have to respond and adapt. So, so I prefer incremental to replicative, but part of incremental relies on replication. Maybe we can settle on that. Now, your other question is much more difficult for me to answer because it depends also on the time view you take. A radical innovation can have very destructive consequences immediately because, when I was speaking today before about academia, if it does not change, being wiped out, this would be a radical destruction of not all, but of many universities that now rely on outmoded models of teaching. But if you look at it with a longer time perspective, this has been going on in history all the time, and then the next generation adapts. The parents will tell the children, don't study in a monodisciplinary way anymore, go to interdisciplinary studies, do this or do that. So there are adaptations that then, help to overcome the destructiveness. But I think Schumpeter's insight basically was right, that every creation also has something that must yield and that will be blown away shorter or later. But it does not mean that nothing will grow after it.
I believe the label is original.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
You asked the question what kind of society we want. I think nobody is asking, is trying to bring some idea. And I would like to express an interesting new concept that was in a recent book from Philip Kurinsky about a concept that unfortunately has not a very good translation in English. It's called l'altruité in French. And it's an idea where every member of this society not only has a responsibility, but also he has some rights. And an example of this is the vaccination. When people, accept to be vaccinated, it's not only to protect themselves from the disease, but it's also to protect the community and the spreading of the virus. So if this concept, is extended, a society maybe, could, be a good society where the individuals accept this equal commitment to, to be responsible, but also, to be in some way, to have some rights. And how these, maybe all the concept, may be part of this new word.
Well, I cannot really answer the question that I posed to you, in what kind of society do we want to live. This is for all of us to talk about and to make it happen. But you are certainly right, a society consisting only of self-centered individuals. It's like in game theory, you have the free riders. At one point, a society of only free riders is unsustainable and will not happen. But you have also the tipping points, people who cooperate, people who defect. And I would say in game theoretical terms, this is an example of defectors and cooperators. And we need the right kind of mixture.
Okay, one last question by Red Gill.
Hi, great talk. I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about, in various talks about interdisciplinary research studies and so forth. I was wondering if any research is being done on the kinds of skills and intellectual background that would make people successful in doing that kind of work, as opposed to just going, okay, we have these specialists and now we're going to bring them together. Is there any research being done on sort of what kinds of people, what kinds of training might actually sort of start people on that road rather than sort of later down? Am I making sense yet? No.
I think what we, no, I cannot answer in any precise way, but I think what is clear is that our present university system, with a focus on disciplines, To some extent, I would defend it because a discipline teaches you what is a good research question. And unless you know how to pose a good research question, you will not get very far. But at the same time, you have to enable, it's like talking in more than one language. You have to become multidisciplinary in a sense that you at least understand what is going on in another discipline. But how to do this, there are various suggestions out there. For instance, teaching in universities a disciplinary course, but having a seminar accompanying this course that brings in another discipline. So you have a sort of, meta interdisciplinary approach being on top of that. So there are various kinds of these experiments that go on.
Okay. Then I would say well, first of all, thank you once again.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
But as Anne already said, we don't never leave it with thank you alone in this place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.